Okay, this is going to be a very heady video for people that are more so into history, politics, and that intersection with theology. And I think it's going to take some explanation. That's probably going to be a long video. So strap in. I think there's definitely a feeling today in America for lots of Orthodox Christians, and not Eastern Orthodox, I mean like conservative, historical, doctrinal Christians, where it's like, it feels like there's this secondary society that has a different religion, that has a different material culture, that has a different sacred world, and it's dominant in our society. And then you kind of have this, what do we do now as Christians who want to return to this kind of rooted Western um, landscape where the sacred world in our society is Christian and the material culture in that same way is intertwined with um, that sacred landscape that we all agree on. Okay, and so here's one of my pitches, I guess, for why we should be Anglican, but also why we should be Christian, and why that has political, national, identitarian, I guess you could say, consequences, right? And why it has to be a material, cultural consequence and not just a sacred space consequence or intellectual consequences, right? And I think Anglicanism is particularly situated to do that, to have that material culture and to have that sacred space culture. What I think is happening is we are kind of so far removed from consequences that we don't really think about anymore, that in retrospect we fail to analyze properly, I think. If you look at a lot of kind of Catholic right wing, how did we get to this crazy place, they tend to say it's Protestantism. Protestantism was the beginning of the end of Western civilization, because what we did was we threw off the binding material culture requirements of Christian civilization, and it became just a matter of cognition, of our internal minds, our beliefs, and there was nothing, I guess, socially binding anymore about Protestantism in the minds of people. And what I'll say is I think that there's a more narrow and more accurate way to describe this phenomenon, although I have sympathy for this description. One of the things I think is very interesting is if you look at the American Revolution and American society, in a way it's just an echo of what happened in the English Civil War, right? In a lot of ways, the English Civil War was the Puritans versus the High Church Anglicans, and dealing about which society, the traditional high church material culture is traditional Western civilization with a monarchy and a strong nobility and all these things. And then on the other side, there's this kind of reformed low church Puritans who are very focused on Pietism, right, which is going to be a recurring motif here, and things like representative democracy over here. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the people who founded the United States were the losers of the English Civil War in the long run. Obviously, they initially win, and then they get kicked out in the Glorious Restoration, and sent back to America, basically. And then those Puritans found the, Massachusetts Bay Colony. And in a lot of ways, the Thanksgiving tradition is the inherited remembrance of this foundational story, that the Puritans are, in a way, our spiritual ancestors of our country. And they created the spiritual landscape in which the material culture of America became manifest, right? So, in a lot of ways, the intellectual mind of the Philadelphia-based Quakers, the Boston-based Congregationalists, these low church kind of Protestant denominations end up defining the American sacred landscape in a way that makes it obviously antithetical to things like high church magisterial Christianity, which includes Catholicism and high church Lutheranism and high church Anglicanism. It's not a coincidence, I think, that the American Revolution sees this basic destruction of the social place of Anglicanism in the United States as an extension of the English civilization. Anglicans have to change their names to Episcopals because the new defining trait is that they even have bishops, they even have a liturgical tradition, and so and obviously we're not English anymore, right? Anglican being English church, right? That they have to kind of throw this off, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the first bishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States is a man named Samuel Seabury. Samuel Seabury, if you have seen, for instance, the Hamilton musical, was an infamous loyalist. He opposed the American Revolution and the Continental Congress and all of these things, and yet he was probably the only one who could survive the transition and lead the Episcopal Church. He was a controversial figure, and yet somehow he was popular enough to become the Archbishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States, despite being very socially, I guess you could say, politically conservative, pro-monarchy, and all those other things. And so because of the Anglican Church's place as the vestige of an English society, which after the American Revolution we got up some of our hang-ups, and a lot of Anglicans were literally thrown out of the country into Canada, or literally just forced to change churches, the Anglican Church starts to diminish, despite the fact that it was the official state church of most of the states after the foundation of the United States into the 19th century. Anglicanism stops being the dominant Christian denomination in the United States and is instead replaced with a variety of similar but scant low church pietistic alternatives. And I think that that's not a coincidence that the Great Awakenings are distinctly American phenomenon, where preachers like Wesley, who their entire life identified as Anglicans, in the American context, and even in England to an extent, but in the American context especially, that means this pietistic, deep, sacred cognition, right? You have to believe, you have to have these kind of feelings of salvation, of the movements of the Holy Spirit. These revivals are intertwined with the foundation of Methodism as a separate denomination, right? It didn't survive as a single movement in the Anglican tradition because of the unspoken understanding that they were two different civilizations. The Methodist people in America were different, distinct in almost in a national sense from the Episcopal or Anglican people, because they believed in a different thing, and that's true when you look at the way they voted, for instance. So if you look into the third party system, which sounds like there's three parties, but really it's a period of a historical American development after the Civil War and before basically the Progressive Era, which is non-coincidentally mostly skipped in American public education. It's basically this war between pietist Christians in America who vote for the Republican Party and liturgical Christians in America who vote for the Democratic Party. Of course, this is a bit skewed by the issues of slavery and civil rights, but this is basically of the divide. This is a snippet right from Wikipedia. Of course, this is sourced, and you can look this up. This is not a controversial description of politics at the time, but here it is. Religious lines were sharply drawn. Methodists, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Scandinavian Lutherans, and other pietists in the North were tightly linked to the Republicans. In sharp contrast, liturgical groups, especially the Catholics, Episcopalians, and German Lutherans, looked to the Democratic Party for protection from pietistic moralism, especially prohibition. While both parties cut across economic class structures, the Democrats were supported more heavily by its lower tiers. Okay. This goes into issues about prohibition as well. You can pause and read the next paragraph if you think that's interesting. But here's what I wanted to talk about with prohibition. In most of the country, prohibition was of central importance in progressive politics before World War I, with a strong religious and ethnic dimension. Most pietistic Protestants were dries, who advocated prohibition as a solution to social problems. These included Methodists, Congregationalists, Disciples, which are the Church of Christ Campbellites, basically, Baptists, Presbyterians, Quakers, and Scandinavian Lutherans. Okay, so there's this pietist faction of people who in America are focused on the moral character, not on material culture, on the sacred world, right? They're focusing on our moral discipline. And then on the other side, the wet side, are the Episcopalians, Irish Catholics, German Lutherans, and German Catholics, who attacked prohibition as a menace to their social customs. Social customs, okay? What is another word for social customs? Material culture and personal liberty. Prohibition has supported direct democracy to enable voters to bypass the state legislatures in lawmaking. In the North, the Republican Party championed the interests of the prohibitionists, while the Democratic Party represented ethnic group interests, so mostly Irish Catholic and German Catholic in the North, and Episcopalians. In the South, the Baptist and Methodist churches, okay, even though the South is dominated by the Democratic Party for other reasons, mostly race-based reasons, in the South, the Baptist and Methodist churches played a major role in forcing the Democratic Party to support prohibition, even though they're kind of crossing party lines here. And in the South, even though they're Methodists who in the North and Baptists who are in the North, those groups would be pietists and so would vote Republican. Their influence transcends party lines to turn the Democratic Party into a prohibitionist party. After 1914, the issue shifted to the Germans' opposition to Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy in the 1920s. However, the sudden unexpected outburst of big city crime associated with bootlegging undermined the support for prohibition, and Democrats took up the cause for repeal, finally succeeding in 1932. Right. So, prohibition, I think, is a hallmark of this issue playing itself out in a very concrete way, and the arguments, I think, are not coincidental. So, right, the liturgical traditions that it keeps bringing up have this kind of actually, let's leave it here. Have this kind of appeal to culture. They have this appeal to, drinking or whatever in moderation is fine. It's not really a moral issue. These things that have a valuable place in material culture. Think of pub culture, Irish Catholics, things like that. Even Episcopalians were on this end of the spectrum. German Lutherans, German culture, a big part of German culture, I mean, everyone can tell you, is things like drinking and pub culture. And so they're saying, look, this material culture element, you can't moralize it away. It's important. And I think, but then on the other side, the prohibitionists are saying, look, this is a moral issue. This is an issue of the sacred world that we have to preserve. Think about the moral degradation that drinking causes. And these guys were considered the progressives at the time. What I think is going on here is the same problem with things like iconoclasm, which I've talked about before from a more theological perspective, but here from a more societal perspective, is the idea is this physical object is going to distract you from the mental world, is the core assumption of lots of pietists. And so they want you to focus on the internal world of yourself and your moral discipline and all of these things, and just kind of work on yourself in a way. And what I think that creates is a iconoclast's Protestant problem of establishment building, because what we can now acknowledge as kind of accepted sociological, psychological principles is that material culture does interfere with the internal world. So these things do have an effect on our mindsets, and I think what the kind of primary conscience of these liturgical groups could not effectively, or maybe they did, but it wasn't a winning argument, is the idea that, look, actually, alcohol does serve a social function. It does serve something valuable. Like, going to the bar and having a drink with your friends is actually, in an abstract, unrooted way, the way that we will have this kind of sacred space. And it's not that Irish Catholics don't really believe in the Bible. I mean, they do. And it's not like Episcopalians at the time don't really believe in the Bible. What they're saying is that this material cultural thing that we think is unrelated or antithetical to the sacred world is actually deeply intertwined with the sacred world, and that it is promoting of it. I think this is why a lot of traditions in low church don't have prayer ropes or rosaries or things like that, prayer beads in the Anglican tradition. But Lutherans, high church Lutherans, and high church Anglicans have nothing against these kinds of physical images. High church Anglicans, high church Lutherans mostly don't really have a problem with the image of saints or the image of Jesus being in places for instruction. Right? If you look at churches, they don't have this problem. And really what the modern psychological term for this is the cognitive behavioral cycle that talks about in cognitive behavioral therapy. So when you do something, you reinforce the mindset that creates that behavior, but also the mindset that creates behavior reinforces these things. If you're afraid of spiders, what a cognitive behavioral therapist will say is that's a mental thing that affects your behavior. So what you kind of have to do is you have to trend your behavior towards as if you were not afraid of spiders. And then eventually your mind will catch up to that lack of fear of spiders because you're acting like you don't. And so that cycle is kind of, a spinning wheel that you kind of have to jump into. And it's hard. It's not easy. You have to jump into an effect and pull the other way or do this thing. And sometimes you'll fail and sometimes you'll succeed. I think that's a deeply Christian idea too, right? That what Jesus is saying a lot of the time is you actually don't know their cognitive state. You just know their behaviors. And what he's concerned with are people, a lot of the times Pharisees, with people that have put a wall between their cognition and their behavior. So Pharisees do all of the behavioral things, but they've found a way to block their cognition, their real belief, their real faith. They found a way to stop it from affecting their minds. And that they don't really have that faith and they don't really believe it because it's easier to stay in their old ways and do these meaningless behaviors to get other people's praise and attention. And I think that's what pietists are worried about accurately. And so what I think needs to happen in a healthy social landscape is you need to have this sacred culture. And this is any social landscape. Not just Christian landscapes. The same thing is true in African cultures, Muslim cultures that don't have Christianity or don't practice Christianity. The same is true in African cultures and Arabic cultures that do practice Christianity. But this is so fundamental that it's necessary for the idea of nation building as well, I would say. And while early Americans were able to have this identity of America based, I would say, mostly on this kind of vague Puritanism, right? The Republican Party at this time, which represents the Pietists, which represents these more reformed traditions, plus the Methodists and the Baptists, it represents these low church traditions. If you look at the elections in this third party system, yes, the South is dominated by Democrats, but that's it. Most of the country and the presidents and the Congress are dominated by Republicans because that version of America won the Civil War, right? That version of America, the Republicans who were the backwoods pietists, who were abolitionists, the random guy from Illinois became president and brought that version of America to the foreground and literally conquered the rest of America. In the North, the Whig Party, which represented the urban North, that maybe a little bit more liturgical North, which eventually would become Democrats in the third party system, their power base is destroyed by the Republican Party. The Whigs no longer exist, and their party is now defined by those pietists who recast all of these separate states into one nation based around that common pietistic identity. And I think what Anglicanism has and what these pietistic successor states do not have is this material culture. I can't help but think it's not a coincidence that as our nation, American nation, has gone into liberalism and this political nation A stuff that I was talking about before, the liturgical traditions, the Democratic Party, which has history with these liturgical roots in the Episcopal Church, and all the and a lots of that kind of civilization. What is happening in a lot of ways is that that material culture is being taken over, and it's affecting the sacred landscape in a way that is nation building. However, on the other side, even today, where you look at the Republican Party and what we would probably call evangelicals today, which they called pietists at the time, there's this kind of rejection of material culture. There's this, I mean, the growth of pop music is kind of I think, in interfering in worship, that it's not separate. It's just kind of this feeling, emotional Christianity that's popular in the evangelical world is worse at nation building, right? And it's kind of got this broad tentism, which is why I think the modern Republican Party is in a lot of ways, or was in a lot of ways before the past couple of decades, defined by libertarianism and political do-what-you-willism, right? And kind of, let's reduce the power of the government. Let's unbind this, because we know that when we give power to the government, it is promoting Nation A. And we don't want it to promote Nation A, so we should just kind of reduce it. But I think that the problem that has is it doesn't build Nation B. I think we kind of have to give up on taking over and conquering Nation A. And I think Anglicanism and material culture of Anglicanism is perhaps a good avenue for this. Why? I think here's the way I would try to conceive of it in some people's minds. One, a lot of people will say, yes, fine, maybe Anglicanism is a weird niche option that would work for this, but why not Catholics? Why not Orthodox? A lot of people are going into Orthodox Christianity for this. And I have to say that it feels like America, that whatever comes out of America, whatever we end up calling Nation B, it's fundamentally in heritage American. Even the America I've been talking about through this whole video, that has roots and is identifiably English in ancestry. And so we're going to always take with us that kind of Protestantism, that kind of Anglo-Saxonism into, even though I have no Anglo-Saxon ancestors, I'm inherently culturally American as someone who grew up in this environment, right? And what we have to do with that is accept it. I don't think there's going to be a Catholic revival in America where all of those evangelical pietists in Nation B are suddenly incorporated into Catholicism. I think they have a lot of grievances that will never be overcome. They're not going to be assimilated into Eastern Orthodoxy either, because that is a totally separate civilization. I mean, if you look at the civilizational trees, you know, the branch that separates the Latin world and the Greek world, it, you know, goes off way before the Latin world and the Anglo-Saxon world. And I just don't think that we'll have that kind of material culture transition. A lot of people have that kind of sacred world transition, and some people have that material culture transition. But I think that if we're going to focus on revival of material culture in building Nation B, Anglicanism is the best candidate. Why? I also can see a lot of the Catholics in Nation B, right, putting up with, allying with, immersing themselves meaningfully in this material culture. The Catholic Church already has an Anglican ordinariate, and it has this structure of, okay, the Eastern Orthodox have this material culture, so we'll have Eastern Catholicism that keeps our sacred landscape but adapts to their material culture. And the same thing would be true about the Anglican ordinariate in this civilizational way. Not that I'm saying we should join the Anglican ordinariate. But what Anglicanism also is inherently national. The word Anglican, unlike all of the other Protestant denominations, is a national word. It just means English, right? St. George, the Angel of Mons, which is a World War I story that I think is so illuminating on the power of that Anglican culture and Christianity had on British society at the beginning of World War One, that they still believed literal angels came down from heaven, saved their troops on the battlefield from the Germans, right? If you read George Eliot, by the way, like Middlemarch, go back, read that. It's just so immersed in the saints, in Christian culture, and it's just a regular story about a girl named Miss Brooke. Okay? She's compared to the Virgin Mary. The opening preface of the book is about St. Teresa of Avila. The song Jerusalem, which is a national English patriotic anthem, is about Joseph of Arimathea and the Christian story of England. It might sound like I'm saying, oh, we should just be English. But I think what we're pulling off here, or what we're going to try to pull off, is in the English Civil War, the Pietist Roundheads were nation B'ified by nation A, and then they created America after they were nation B'd, right? And it has a lot of the trappings of its history. And so what I'm saying we do when we build our nation B, as if we're nation B'ified by the nation A of the systemic order of the day, what we're going to have to do is bring some of that stuff with us, like the Puritans did. And those things that are valuable are embedded in the Anglican way of living. That material culture, the Book of Common Prayer, the saints' days, liturgical vestments, those kinds of things are such concrete material culture. And what we can do is we can say, instead of having to build it all from scratch, we can say, let's take these things with us. And we can take Anglicans from the past and think like George Eliot. If we had to make a nation B public school, what would be their necessary reading list, right? And we can say, okay, English, Shakespeare, Anglican associated sacred space stuff into our material culture, which is what I think the English society was for so long, and can give us a good guide and stepping off point for a project like this in the modern day. The Anglican Church in North America, which I am a part of, is weirdly accidentally falling into this, completely unbeknownst to themselves. I mean, if you look at the previous image of St. George, his cross, right, he's the national patron saint of England. Through the iconography of history, the Anglican Church in North America kind of has this like image here, right, of St. George's cross spreading across North America, right? There's this kind of a national identity pervasiveness thing here, and there's this alliance of material culture and liturgical culture and sacred space culture in the Anglican Church, and they don't know why that's making them successful. I talk all of the time to people in my comments on my Instagram page who are telling me, hey, I go to an Anglican Church North America church because I was basically nation B'ified by Jordan Peterson, so they became Christians for that reason. They found that they wanted to be Protestant Christians, and that this had this kind of deep historic feeling to it, and it was Orthodox, Christianly conservative, not like the Episcopal Church, which is hijacked by Nation A, right? And, the reason the Anglican Church in North America split off from the Episcopal Church is the controversies over gay marriage. Once the Episcopal Church allowed gay marriage, and Anglicans who did not want to affirm gay marriage left and made our denomination. So what happened in the following decade, you can ask any Anglican pastor, is there's this kind of, as gay marriage became more socially acceptable, there's been this kind of uneasiness to admit that to congregants who just kind of walk into ACNA churches, because it feels like, oh, is that your whole identity? And pastors kind of tiptoe around the conservative implications of our denomination. But what they're finding is that, what used to happen in the 80s and 90s, where conservative Christians had to kind of mince their words and had to kind of keep the conservative parts of Christianity, the sexual ethics, all these things secret, and then like surprise gotcha after the Seeker Safe movement, and you kind of bring these people in, and then you say, look, this is what is, or a real relationship with Christ looks like, what they're finding now is that actually those are the selling points for lots of young people who grew up in nation A, and they're just totally deracinated. They were looking for something that is entirely different to that, and what we can give them in this is nation B. The Anglican Church North America, which is a successor state of a national church, the Anglican Church of England, which was a broad tent church. It can entertain lots of a variety of theological opinions while being distinctive in its material culture. It's not a coincidence that Episcopalians, when they are picking, oh, what are we going to pick our new name? It wasn't even a real question. It wasn't really like, oh, well, we could be the Cranmerians, we could be whatever. I think it was actually originally called the Protestant Episcopal Church, because that episcopacy, that bishop succession, that material inheritance, that physical institution of the church, vestments, like you can see Foley Beach here, who's the archbishop. You can see in that picture in the bottom right, there are Orthodox priests there, and there are Anglican priests there. Probably some of you can tell which ones are which, but anyone who's not initiated in the real nitty-gritty of vestments probably couldn't tell you which ones are Eastern Orthodox and which ones are Anglican. Maybe the guy with the hat is obviously Eastern Orthodox, but then look at the rest of them. Obviously someone could tell. But my point is that they look like they're doing the same thing, and that's that dedication to material culture. And whereas it was probably, especially in the 90s in evangelical Christianity, that material culture was a downside, it is now the foundational building block for what we are going to do in the future in this nation B'ism. And that the Anglican Church, in a way, can be the national church of nation B. And we can fill that sacred space with good Orthodox Christianity of all kinds, of just good old-fashioned Orthodox Christianity, historic Christianity, and then fill the spaces of material culture with something fundamentally historic and rooted rather than arbitrary. And that roots we can find in the Anglican tradition. Thank you.